Well, thank you all for coming. Short notice, I know, for some. I know everybody's keen to get into it, so I'll keep the formalities short. I'm Ben Oquist, Executive Director of the Australia Institute. Thank you to all of you for coming and wanting to be engaged. Democracy is about those who turn up before and after elections, and informed citizenry is what makes the place work. And there has been a terrible trend away from a belief in politics, trust in politics, and it's leading to a decline of faith and trust in democracy itself. And it's kind of one of the reasons why the Australia Institute exists, actually, to try and play an active, positive role in our democracy and allow all of us to participate in it, and events like this are part of that. So thank you for all turning up. Before we begin tonight's proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay respect to their elders past and present. And I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in attendance here today. We love hosting politics in the pub, but we can't do it on our own. We put it on for free, but it's not free to organise. So give us some support if you can. Please consider donating to the Australia Institute. It's all online. Jump on there. Do it on your phone right now. We have a fantastic press gallery panel with us here today, and I just was thanking them for making the trouble. It's not part of their day job. They've got busy jobs. Journalism has been under a lot of pressure, and most journalists are under a lot of pressure every day. And they've made the effort to come out here today after a very busy, stressful time for many journalists, under the pump, to share their experiences, insights, thoughts, wisdoms about what happened. And I'll introduce them to start with. We've got Clare Armstrong on my left here. She's the national political reporter for the Daily Telegraph. She covers a wide range of issues with a particular interest in regional Australia. Clare received the 2021 National Press Club's Wallace Brown Young Journalist Award for her political reporting, and has previously been recognised in her rural social and Indigenous affairs coverage, and you can find her writing in the Daily Telegraph, as I said. To her left is Krishani Dhanji. He's a political correspondent, audio journalist and producer for SBS News, and previously worked for Sky News and was a breakfast presenter at 2RRR Radio in, well, it says in Sydney, but I thought it was in Melbourne, but Sydney as well. Good to hear. And on the far left is Paul Karp, political reporter for Guardian Australia. He fields of expertise, law and politics, industrial relations, discrimination, but he writes broadly about politics. He's previously worked as industrial relations reporter at Thomson Reuters. Please welcome a really important panel of journalists. I'm going to spend the first half of our hour talking to our guests and getting into what happened in the election campaign, but then we're going to throw it open to you. And there'll be a mic in the middle here. Not going to hand it round, but it'll be in the middle in a nice COVID-safe fashion. So if you want to ask a question, get prepared to be jump up in the middle there. There'll be a mic there that Hannah will help you with halfway through. I'm going to start with you, Clare. What happened? Did you expect it?
Well, we had a change of government born out of a number of factors, not just in the last 6 weeks, but the last 3, even, and 9 years. And I suppose it's always a dangerous thing to say whether you expected it or not. I did plan to be on Anthony Albanese's campaign bus for the last week, because I felt that was probably going to be the winning side. So I suppose to an extent, but I probably wouldn't have told you that if I'd chosen the other way. So, but broadly what I think happened is we had a moment of deep enfranchisement across the Australian population. I think I noted a few weeks ago that the number of, for example, 18 to 29-year-olds enrolled over the last 2 election cycles was at record highs, and not only that, this was a group of people who for the first time in their parents', even their grandparents' lives, were living in electorates that weren't necessarily safe. And I think we saw a mass movement in different ways, in different directions across the country of people taking an interest in their local concerns, local matters, and voting accordingly.
And do you think that is driven more by young people than the current narrative suggests? What was special about this time?
I don't think it was exclusively driven by young people. I mean, until we have the full breakdown of exit polls and things, I know a lot has been said, for example, about the women's vote. Of course, that's conjecture because we don't actually know specifically. Once you put the ballot in the box, we don't know who voted how. But I think that from the issues that were at the forefront of this campaign, either being spoken about by the leaders or at a local level, were the things that young people and women and other groups were talking about for quite a long time. We've had a lot of these issues, be it climate, be it integrity, be it women's equality, that have featured particularly in those groups as a galvanising, I guess, main issue for them, but that's not necessarily reflected in election results, whereas this time it really was.
Yes, and I hope I'm not going to get in trouble here from the office, so block your ears if you hear the office. We've conducted some exit polling, and the results have come back in today, and it does show that women's issue was a real problem for Scott Morrison, one of the highest negative issues for him throughout the campaign. And the polling showed that there was a gap between women voters and men voters, and you're right, we don't know if that's been repeated on polling day, but we can only presume it was. Yeah. Krishani, what struck you about the election campaign and where it went?
I would say that there was also a lot of the things that Claire said there are absolutely bang on. I would say also that there was a real move towards diversity and multicultural representation in Parliament. We've seen the most diverse Parliament that we've ever had, which I think is incredibly significant. And a lot of that came from the sort of shift away from the major parties, and I think also a recognition from the major parties that people, particularly from the sort of marginalised communities, do have voices and do want to see themselves represented in Parliament. So there was a real sort of move towards that representation, which I think will manifest itself in the policy and the decisions that are made in the next 3 years to come. I think the women's vote in particular, I'd seen some research before the election that said that women were both more undecided and also that some women were a little less in favour of Scott Morrison and his character, which definitely could have had an impact on the result there, as well as that young people's vote. I think as well the fact that we had incredibly low primary votes for both major parties is also quite telling in what people want to see from their parliament in the future, and that move towards the teal independents, towards the Greens and other independents as well, is something that's going to be really interesting. We've got a big crossbench, we've got a really big crossbench in the Senate. So how the Labor Party negotiates with them, obviously climate and integrity are really big issues for those crossbenchers. So whether they'll be challenging the major parties to have more progressive or to have higher targets on those sorts of things will be interesting to see as well, and to see that dynamic play out. So.
Thanks, Krishani. Yeah, we might come to that. Interesting, I was adding up the number of crossbenchers across both houses today, and I got to 34. So it is a big number of people. Paul, what do you think happened? And a number of points have been raised there by Clare and Krishani. Claire's pointed to young people. She's pointed to the fact that it's been over a number of years, these build-ups. Krishani says it's there's a kind of diversity speaking up. I think the election is the most transformative since 1972. I mean, the history's in front of us, but while Anthony Albanese's had a narrow win on the numbers, probably get to 76, the coalition's actually lost in a landslide. And those two things don't sound like they add up, but something pretty big did happen, yeah?
Yeah, so parts of the country that don't normally determine elections swung against the coalition and delivered seats mainly to the crossbench, but also to Labor and the Greens. So, you know, North Sydney, Wentworth, Mackellar, Kooyong, Goldstein, these are all seats that the coalition has held for decades. They're seats of former Liberal Prime Ministers. And so there was this huge enfranchisement of sort of small L Liberals in those areas, that their vote mattered for the first time in a long time. And so, you know, some Labor members were returned in those sorts of places, like Higgins and Bennelong. The Greens had a great result breaking through in several electorates in Brisbane, and then of course the teal wave. And so the coalition has lost votes to all of those parties. I would pick up on what the others have said about women, that actually women had Scott Morrison figured out before everyone else, because the progressive parties polled better amongst women in the 2019 election, but it was just that Morrison, his advantage among men was so much greater than Bill Shorten that he managed to dodge a bullet and get re-elected. But I think what we saw on the weekend is that he was judged on his record in office, the 3 years of him actually being Prime Minister, rather than on the images of, can he pretend to be good at other people's job? Was he good at his own job? And the answer was a resounding no.
Interesting. You talk about the different seats that swung this time. Adding up the seats, the net wins or losses for Labor in Queensland was interesting today, because the Greens are probably just ahead in the count in Brisbane. And if that's the case, well, I'll go back to the beginning. At the beginning of the campaign, there was a lot of talk, from Labor included, that their path to victory was through Queensland, and they'd win a host of seats there, and a number were rattled off. Yet we come out of the election with a thumping win for Albanese, or a thumping loss for the coalition, and it looks like a net -2 seats for Labor in Queensland. So it's a very different electoral math than we usually hear. Often talk about outer urban seats as being the key swing seats, and you've pointed to something different happening at this election. Do you think that that's an enduring shift, that there's going to be a whole new bunch of marginal seats now?
Well, I think it's sort of impressive that Labor was able to reach a slim majority by winning seats elsewhere. I mean, 4 seats in WA is a great return for them, and 3 in New South Wales, 2 in Vic, and 1 in SA. So it's incredible they found a pathway to win despite losing a seat in Queensland. But I think that there's some upside to that for Labor, in that there are seats that they could come back and win at the next election in Queensland, like Longman and Flynn. That, you know, their vote is not at a high watermark in Queensland. It has proved to be a more progressive state than the sort of 2D caricature that some people might have of it. So I don't think that's the end of the world for them, to be honest. I think that's more of a danger for the coalition.
I was just going to say that going forward, the immediate impact will be a lot more three-corner races. You know, the Greens may end up in second place in Brisbane, and you would assume that majority of the Labor preferences will flow to them. They'll hold the seat. Next time around, maybe Labor are gunning for second place, and they get the Greens preferences. So, if anything, what this has done is open up and crack. You know, the Labor on a number of occasions have had cracks at Brisbane, Boothby, Higgins, you know, those seats that they perennially sort of get so close yet so far to. The defining difference in nearly every seat they picked up, probably with the exception of Higgins, didn't really have a strong, obvious independent element, was that they've broadened out into three-corner races, and that then makes, in a weird way, those seats almost more viable for them than less.
Interesting. We touched on there Scott Morrison's unpopularity, and in particular with women. What about the effect of Barnaby Joyce and the National Party, and the differences between the Liberal Party and the National Party, and Barnaby Joyce's unpopularity? Someone I was putting this to someone this afternoon, they said, well, yeah, he was unpopular, but don't discount Matt Canavan's interventions during the campaign and what they might have done to the Liberal vote in certain places. Got some perspectives there?
I might jump in again. Sorry, I did. So for background, I lived in Queensland for many years, worked at the Courier Mail and the Townsville Bulletin, so I'm fairly familiar with that patch of Queensland, central Queensland, I guess. Look, I think obviously there was, in the teal seats, a vote for Morrison is a vote, or a vote for the Liberals is a vote for Barnaby. That was obviously played out. And for the first time ever, the Liberals had to deal with this issue that they've lambasted Labor for many, many elections, which is you say one thing in Gladstone and another thing in Sydney or Melbourne. But I also would say that look at what Barnaby did in Lingiari. How many times did Labor have to go there? Because the Country Liberal Party was having a real crack and did have a real crack, and it's pretty marginal now. Flynn, you talk about the path that Labor had through Queensland. Flynn was a big part of that in central Queensland. It was widely believed that Labor had that in the bag. Barnaby spent most of the election there with Matt, and they held on to the seat. In fact, as Barnaby has been telling anyone that will listen in the last 48 hours, he didn't lose a seat, which you could argue that his role was supposed to be to try and pick up things like in the Hunter and in Lingiari, but he didn't lose any seats. So to the extent that it clearly hurt the Liberals, and were they a good coalition partner, I think there are a lot of Liberals right now packing up their offices who say they weren't a good coalition partner. But if you say their job was to not lose any seats and to sandbag where they thought there were issues and have a crack in regional seats where Barnaby does play pretty well, then they also succeeded at that.
Krishani and Paul, Clare says National Party didn't lose any seats, but did they lose Liberal seats?
There's certainly been that argument, and I think particularly the moderate Liberals have said that climate change argument where Barnaby Joyce and Matt Canavan in particular, who said net zero was dead just before the last election, was particularly damaging. Barnaby Joyce has, as Claire said repeatedly that the National Party didn't lose seats. They really gained ground both in Lingiari and Hunter as well, and he's made a lot of mention of that. And Barnaby Joyce has also been quite quick to separate the Nationals and the Liberals. So rather than it be a coalition, really trying to make that distinction that the Nationals did hold their seats. They gained a bit of ground almost, but it was the Liberals themselves who lost those seats. But certainly, I think anyone who is in those moderate Liberal electorates will say that the climate debate in particular had a big effect on their losses, where those teal independents, their central argument was climate change.
I had a conversation with Michael McCormack that I reported where he said, it wasn't my name that they were plastering over the inner city seats. Obviously pointing out that the Greens and Independents had said that a vote for the Liberals is a vote for Barnaby Joyce. He also made the point that, I sat in the room with the person who said that net zero is dead when we agreed that was going to be the policy, and that if you sign up to it in return for all the pork the National Party got, all the projects and all the infrastructure spending, only to then in Matt Canavan's case say that it was dead, in Colin Boyce's case to say that net zero was flexible. I mean, that's hardly sticking to your word, is it?
Well, you can't have it both ways, you don't think, Paul? I want to get into the campaign a little bit itself. At one level, I think what you've all potentially said is the campaign didn't count. Maybe it was already done before it started. But maybe get into a slightly different way. What did you most enjoy in the campaign? What were the moments that stuck out to you, either for ill or for good?
Do you want to start up that end?
Oh, that's so rude. So I actually spent the majority of the last 6 weeks, actually pretty much all of the last 6 weeks on the road. It's been very nice to be home in my own bed for the last 2 days. So I was there on the first day of the campaign in Launceston with Anthony Albanese. And everyone obviously knows what happened, but I can't go past it as a moment, not because, and I'm sure we will get questions about this later, but not because of anything we set out to do, but because if you actually go back and watch that 40 minutes, it starts with me asking how Labor would lift wages by how much and when he thought that would happen, and how would that be possible given the unemployment rate in Tasmania, which for anyone watching at home was about 3.9. It was well below it was 3.7, maybe below the national average. And I asked if he knew what it was, and he drove by, fine. He then got a question about the cash rate, drove by it, less fine. And then we sort of got into this space where, and this is something I'll maybe talk a bit about later, about how he's sort of dealt with press conferences, where he knew he was on the ropes and he had a bit of a crack at the journos. There was actually an unrelated question about housing, and he thought the smartest thing in the world to do right now is to say, oh, and there's actually a minister for housing, but do any of you journalists even know who that is? And, you know, I resisted all urge to say, it's Michael Sukkar, like I know how to do my job to yours. Instead, I said, okay, is this an election where we're just not going to ask these questions? We're not going to ask the price of bread. We're not going to ask the price of petrol. We're not going to ask you if you know the cash rate. Are you saying here and now, on day one of this election, that you don't think that those questions are a part of your job? He had an opportunity on the first day of the election to say, I don't think that that's a part of this job. And he didn't. He said, no, of course not. Of course, people need to be across their brief. Of course, they need to know the answer. And then 30 seconds later, Andrew Clennell from Sky News went, what's the national unemployment rate? You know, he walked into that over time. And I think that 3 seconds gets played over and over again. But what actually happened over the course of 40 minutes was a genuine back and forth and discussion between the press and the future Prime Minister over what he expected to be able to have to know. And he said, come at me. And you know, for the next 6 weeks, the press did. So that's probably my moment.
Thank you. Maybe while you're collecting your thoughts, you two, to think about moments too. One thing I'll ask you while you think about moments, do you think Albo stuffed up in his strategy in the beginning, allowing or inviting such long press conferences and opening himself up right at the beginning when he said, you know, I'm going to be unlike the other guy and take lots of questions? Was one, it was a problem obviously that he didn't know the answer, but two, was the strategy wrong to start with by opening himself up so much?
I think that there was a good strategy there potentially, because as a leader you do want to differentiate yourself from the other side, and there had been a lot of criticism of Scott Morrison for shutting down questions or for picking the journalists that he wanted to take questions from particularly. And so there was certainly merit in that strategy of saying, I'm open, I'm here to answer all the questions, don't worry, we'll get through them, I will remain accountable. But with that, there's obviously the requirement of knowing your stuff and being confident to be able to answer all the questions to that ability. And so while there was good intention there potentially, the carry through, or rather the execution, might have needed a little bit of work.
Paul, you got a moment, or you want to answer both those questions?
I'll try both in one. I got a question at a Morrison press conference despite him trying to avoid me by hanging out a window. That was my high point, because the way it happened was he was taking questions on his right, wouldn't take me. I spotted a window in a house to his left that he'd just been touring through with some new homeowners. And I went back into the house and poked my head out the window and managed to get a question in there. But it was an important question. It was about COVID, because COVID had barely been mentioned in the entire campaign. Mark Riley got a question in about, you know, a week earlier about, you know, is it really over? But no one had really asked, what are we going to do to actually try and stop, you know, 50 deaths a day? That was the question. And what Morrison did was to look at a piece of paper and to quote the death statistics about, you know, this many deaths in aged care, this many deaths in the last 24 hours. And it was really obvious to me that the question that he was prepared for was a gotcha question. He was waiting for someone to say, how many deaths were there in the last 24 hours? You don't know, therefore you don't care. Or, you know, how many deaths, you know, this year, or in aged care? He was prepared for a pop quiz. But what he wasn't prepared for was to actually answer the question about what they were going to do about it. Because after he'd exhausted the statistics on this piece of paper, the answer was, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. And there was no change. It was just a slur about, Anthony Albanese will probably send us all back into lockdown. So I mean, that was my best moment because it was trying to punch through something that hadn't been asked before. And to come back to the second part of the question, I think a lot of this Anthony Albanese doesn't know and Scott Morrison does know is really that he was just better prepared. He had the figures printed on a page. And when he wanted to escape questions and walk out of a press conference, there was a shorter escape route and he had staffers there shouting, thanks media, so that it wouldn't be obvious on the television coverage that he was leaving without having answered all of our questions.
Wow. A great insight into how the campaign works and how journalists trying to get questions up work. Do any of you think there was a pivotal point in the campaign? I mean, at the start of it, in the first few weeks, you would have said the pivotal point was Albanese's stuff up, but obviously in retrospect, that's not the pivotal point, or the campaign doesn't count. Is there a point that marked to you when Scott Morrison was going to win or lose? I was struck by a change in vibe from the Labor side when the inflation figure came out and the interest rate figure came out. I thought that put a zing in their stride. But are there other points that work for you?
I would say 2 points. One was when Anthony Albanese started wielding the dollar. That was really smart to be going on wages, because the 3.9% unemployment just sort of pales in comparison to the significance of everything's going up but your wages, and that was a very powerful moment. The other moment I would say is Scott Morrison promising or suggesting that he would change by saying he'd been a bit of a bulldozer but he'd be less of one in the future, because that was basically conceding that the whole election strategy wasn't working. Labor was offering change, Morrison was offering better the devil you know and you can't risk change under Labor, and then he had to come out a week from the election and say, oh, actually maybe I'm the change candidate. He may as well have conceded at that point. It was so obvious that their frame for the election had lost at that point.
I think another particularly strong moment was when Scott Morrison a few times backed in his handpicked candidate Catherine Deves in Warringah. There were a few times that he did that. Journalists were asking about it, whether he still backed in all of her comments, whether he supported what she was saying. Notably, he said, I wouldn't say it in that way, but essentially...
He said he wasn't a surgeon, actually.
Yeah. But there's been a lot of commentary since, particularly in those teal seats and those progressive seats, that was particularly damaging for them. And so the number of times that he did that and supported her rather than protecting others in the party and the moderates within the party, I think that was also quite telling of the campaign.
I think the coalition campaign was kind of like that knight in Monty Python that kind of kept having limbs locked off. And I don't mean that to probably
just a flesh
sounds
wound.
harsh. Yeah, it was a bit like that. They went into the campaign with a clear strategy of making this a referendum on national security and on the economy, and by extension of that, cost of living. So in the second week of the campaign, when we had the Solomons, it made the National Security Forum quite a difficult one for them to navigate. And then the accumulative effect of the 5.1% inflation and then the interest rate going up. We had a press conference in the Melbourne Commonwealth Parliamentary Offices with Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison the day that the RBA handed down the interest rate, the cash rate rise, I should say. And the first question that the Prime Minister was asked by SBS, your colleague Anna Henderson, was, have you just lost the election? And it sounds glib, and I think we're allowed to say this now. We all colluded and we agreed that whoever he pointed to first was going to ask that question, because not because we were trying to be silly, but because it was true that you can talk about and I'm not entirely sure. I agree with Paul that the dollar thing was a really important way to articulate wages, because I have sat up on that hill for 3 years watching Jim Chalmers talk about real wage rises, and I've gone, no one in hell knows what a real wage rise is.
That's what the dollar's for.
Yeah,
It's the prop.
that's what I
Clear.
mean though. But I think that was only born out of the fact that Australians, millions of homeowners around the country, were getting a notice from their bank saying your mortgage is going to go up. And that really solidified, I think, everything is going up except your wage, because here it is in written form or email. I don't have a mortgage, so I don't know, but it's for another day. But I think that the accumulative effect of them losing the two main issues that they wanted to fight the election on really hamstrung them. And I think that is what I'm Not a Bulldozer really was born out of. It was that Hail Mary last-ditch effort to show that I was a Prime Minister in a certain time, for a certain time, but in a new version of the time, the one where your mortgage goes up and China is there and actually quite scary and all the other things, I can be different. And obviously the electorate didn't buy it.
I'm going to get a question from the audience in a minute, so watch out for that microphone, which I think is going to be put in the middle there. So you get a chance to ask what you want. I wanted to come back to the teals for a minute, because undoubtedly when the history books are written, that's going to be one of the big factors of the election campaign. And two-part question, were they all the same, or were they 6 separate campaigns? And looking back on it, if one was going to win, were they all going to win? And what's your prognosis about whether they keep their seats?
I don't think they're all the same. You only have to look at the fact that some of them were previously members of the Labor Party, like Monique Ryan and Kate Cheney, and some of them are sort of liberals from central casting, like Allegra Spender, to know that. And some of their ideas have been very different in terms of economic questions about what to do with tax. So I don't think they are all the same, but you're right that the central issues that they chose to fight the election on, integrity, climate change, and women were very similar. They weren't all destined to win at the same time or lose at the same time, but they were all advantaged by the same forces of having a deeply unpopular Prime Minister, and often Liberal MPs who weren't very deft at making the argument that really we have been trying to achieve change from within, and pointing to what they had managed to achieve. Net zero is not nothing. They managed, like the coalition agreed to net zero by 2050. A lot of the people that lost also crossed the floor on adding protection for LGBTQ students in the religious discrimination bill. If only they'd been allowed to cross the floor on ICAC, they could have kicked another significant plank out of the platform that managed to defeat them all. So no, I don't think they're all the same. As for whether they keep their seats, it depends what quality of representation they bring over this term of Parliament. It's a little harder with Labor in a slim majority, because if they want, they can ignore those people. But I think there are signs already that they won't. Tony Burke has said that he wants to fix Parliament and is already taking on ideas from the crossbench, a lot of them advanced by the Australia Institute, about how to fix things like question time and having private members' bills actually voted on. So I think there's a good chance that they'll have a good record of achievement, rather than just be ruthlessly blocked as they were in the last term with a slim coalition majority.
I think they also, a lot of them run really, really strong grassroots campaign, really talking to the community, getting a sense of what they wanted. And I would agree that a lot of them have come from different sides, different areas, and have different priorities. It's just that the climate, the integrity was a sort of umbrella for a lot of them that really pushed them through. I think that if you look to members like Andrew Wilkie, to Helen Haynes, who have been incredibly effective, Andrew Wilkie in particular has been in Parliament for quite a while and is wildly popular within his electorate. If you look to them and then sort of compare some of the impacts that these teal independents might be able to make on the climate change front, on the integrity front, particularly if you have that negotiation really working with the Labor Party, it might well be the case that the electorates are really happy with what they see. If we see private members' bills being brought to Parliament, that people within those electorates will be satisfied. And if they continue running those really strong grassroots campaigns, that they could be there for a while longer. It just depends on whether the major parties will catch up to them and do the same.
Claire, before you answer, give you answer the question, but there's I wanted to put something else to you. Andrew Wilkie's come up there, and I saw you write this week that Andrew Wilkie hadn't ruled out a tilt at the speakership. What chance do you think of that? And I guess it's part of a broader question that's been alluded to here, how Labor's going to work with the crossbench, that they don't necessarily need numerically if they're at 76. Will they work with them, and will that help them keep their seats? Will they put somebody like Andrew Wilkie in the speakership?
Well, if they get to 76, they probably do need Andrew Wilkie in the Speaker's chair, because that would leave, if they put one of their own in, that would leave 75. And in the extremely unlikely but entirely possible event that the entirety of the crossbench and the coalition vote against Labor, you'd have a tie, vote the Speaker, it gets messy, it doesn't really look like you're governing for the majority. He hasn't ruled it out, but that's not to say that he's ruled it in either. I'll say that much. But
so you think he's open to it?
Well, he's been there a long time, and it's a bit of a legacy thing. Like, people often joke, but it's not true. If you want a nice portrait and a pay rise, and I'm not saying that that's why he got into Parliament, but if he's looking to change things up a little bit, that could be, it's an option. It's a live option. Of any of the crossbench, I would say he's the more likely candidate. Of course, Labor could end up getting 77, and we won't have to talk about it.
So if they got to 77, they wouldn't bother.
Wouldn't need to.
Yep. Okay.
I'm just saying
before Claire gets going, if you do want to ask a question, come up here and ask one, because I'm really happy to keep asking them. I could talk to these guys all day and all night, but if you want a question, start lining up. Sorry, Claire.
On the Teals, whether they'll be re-elected, I think the Teals that have come from rusted on, safe Liberal seats couldn't have wished for a better Labor government in terms of how they'll be able to navigate the local issues that they're agitating for without having to be forced to vote certain ways on big reforms or big changes that their constituents wouldn't necessarily like. For example, no one is going to ask Allegra Spender whether she should vote to get rid of negative gearing, something that I imagine her constituents would have a pretty big problem with. So I actually do think they are aided by the fact that Anthony Albanese is coming into government with a relatively narrow mandate, but specifically one that bakes in things like stage 3 tax cuts and rules out a number of the Bill Shorten era reforms that are the kinds of things that people in Kooyong and Goldstein and North Sydney would rather not have happen. So I think they are going to be aided by not having to make the big calls and big stands on some of those sort of more traditionally left-leaning kind of reforms.
Well, we've got a line up here. That's good. Over to you.
Do you think that under Dutton, the likely new leader of the Liberals, do you reckon that under Dutton, the Liberals could adapt to what the voters want by next election?
Start at the other end. Start at Paul, and we'll move across.
Well, he's from the Conservative faction, and so it's tempting to say that they've lost their smaller Liberal heartland, and so Dutton's toxic, and they'll never get back into government if they make him leader. But sadly, I think that's a progressive fantasy. I mean, Tony Abbott was pretty conservative as well, and was devastatingly effective as opposition leader. So don't count them out just if they make Dutton leader. I think it depends whether they indulge in, US style culture war issues that they're actually not the majority opinion on, in which case it would be toxic, or if they just focus on economic issues with Dutton as leader, I think they're a very good shot, you know, to make up seats, if not the entire way to 76 at the next election. So we'll see if he can hold them together and just keep Labor to account about, you know, inflation and wage rises and all the other things as the agenda for this term. And yeah, sadly, don't count them out.
As we go across, so we don't think they're in an impossible wedge where to win back the teal seats they'd have to move left and then they'd lose seat voters on the right?
Well, certainly, as Jim Chalmers, Anthony Albanese have already pointed out, they're inheriting quite a difficult term of Parliament on the national security, on the economy, and so they're going to have a lot of things to need to try and work out. And Peter Dutton has been in the past and certainly will be quite effective in that opposition role of trying to poke holes in what the government is doing, and has been quite an effective communicator in that way. As Paul just mentioned, like Tony Abbott was very, very effective in opposition. And so they're going to be doing a lot of soul searching and a big post-mortem at this point. And a lot of the moderate Liberals have pointed out the fact that if their entire sort of section has been decimated, that'll need to be regrown. And so there's certainly room for them to be able to poke enough holes and to be able to try and rebuild that moderate space within the party that they might, you know, you never know, at the next election they might be able to recoup a lot of that loss.
Claire?
Yeah, I don't really have much more to add. I think that it is really important to note that as much as people in certain electorates, certain demographics may, you know, scoff at their sort of way out thereism of some of the culture wars that the Conservatives rage, that conversely some of the hot button kind of progressive issues are also flash in the pan moments for other large swathes of the electorate. Once we have a federal ICAC, for example, who's going to go to the next election still talking about one. So when you start to lop off at either end those kind of key issues, what you're left with in the middle is fundamentally the economy, and that is a space that Dutton and the remaining Liberals are very comfortable with, and I don't think that should be discounted.
Oh, if I could add one point, sorry. Though Barnaby Joyce, though, has thrown open the door as to whether the net zero by 2050 commitment will remain. So if that becomes another big issue for the coalition over the next 3 years, and they simply can't decide whether they'll support more climate change action or not, that could also affect their chances, particularly in those sort of more progressive areas. So.
Thank you. We'll get through some more questions here.
The Liberal Party will go away and reflect, and the Labor Party will go away and reflect. What will the media reflect on their campaign and their management of the campaign, and what changes might we expect in the next election?
Can I add one to that as we're going through? I was really fascinated. Clare didn't dwell on it at the time. Your little secret that you'd caucused a question there to put the Prime Minister off his game, and you're going to ask the same one. How much do you answer the question? But how much do you work together when you're on the road like that?
There are moments. I think there's, in any given day, several issues that are issues of the day or left over from the day before, the week before, and we want to make sure we get a spread of issues covered in the limited access we get to the leaders each day. I mean, you know, I joke about that one, but to that level it doesn't really happen very much. But I think there's a general understanding that across 20 or 30 people you're going to get a good spread of what's going on. I think if I can answer that question more broadly, the day in Parramatta where we screamed at Scott Morrison so loudly about, I think it was something to do with the Solomons, that I couldn't even hear really what the question was at that point. I didn't get any mentions on Twitter. The day that I argued for about a minute with Scott Morrison over whether he thought that what Catherine Deves had said, apologised for and then retracted was appropriate, I actually got applause on Twitter the day that we had a 40-minute press conference with Scott Morrison arguing with him about why it was significant that he had reneged on a previous commitment to put protections for LGBTQI students and teachers up into Parliament at the same time as religious discrimination. Didn't hear a peep. I think that sometimes the echo chamber that exists in the places where the media is most spoken about does have selective hearing. And if that echo chamber has a problem with the way that, for example, Anthony Albanese was approached on a number of occasions, I would have liked to have thought they had a problem with the way that a conservative side of politics was approached. And maybe you do have a problem with both. And if that's the case, then all I would say is there isn't a journalist who wakes up at 4 a.m, works all day, goes to bed at God knows what time, that isn't there trying to exact an answer for a good reason. And I think that it is a great tragedy to an extent that sometimes you see an audience reacting to a press conference having, not through any fault of their own, but no ability and no understanding of every conversation that's come before that, every conversation that will come after, everything that's happened in all the in-between times, and all the emails and all the written media requests and all the back and forth with the staffers and all the back and forth off the record with the leaders or with the ministers. Only one part of our job is televised. I personally would love it if the cameras stopped. I'm a print journalist. I personally would love it if the cameras stopped flashing me up on the screen, but that is the way that things go. So I would say broadly, what I will reflect on is that I just want to keep coming back to work and asking questions that I think the electorate deserves to know the answer to, not because that's obvious necessarily in the moment live on Sky or ABC 24, but because it's obvious in the story I'm working on for tomorrow, for the next day, for the next week. An example I'll finish on is we were in Chisholm about a week or two before the campaign ended, and I asked Scott Morrison about if he was worried that there was a lack of distinction between his criticism of China, the country, or the government rather, and Chinese people and the impact that was having on Chinese Australians. It wasn't because the next day I was writing an article about it. It was because I knew from talking to Chinese Australians that it was a problem, and I needed to get his answer on that. You know, I was criticised for asking him a Dixer and letting him give a big plug to Gladys Liu, but that was because I'd already spoken to all the Chinese Australians. I already knew what the answer was. I just needed his response to it. So I would just say not all is as it appears in my defence of my profession.
Well, thank you for your honest observations and coming here to answer the questions. Krishani and Paul, any observations that you think the press should do differently, or how you wish things could be done differently, or lessons learned?
Look, I wasn't on the campaign road. I was in Canberra the whole time. So I sort of sat back and saw everything come in as it happened, which I think gives me a slightly different perspective. But I think Claire's right in that there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes and during the press conferences where if you're not glued to Sky or ABC 24 and you're just seeing the little sound grabs and little upsots that happen in the nightly news, it's a very different picture to what does happen, and a lot of that background work as well. And I think even on, I think it was the day before the election, or a couple of days before the election, when Anthony Albanese was with Julia Gillard and Peter Malinauskas in Adelaide, he had a much easier day than Scott Morrison did on that day. And so there is a bit of give and take within those scenarios, and sometimes we'll go harder on one leader than we do on another. And I think potentially with this election, it was very different and it was a little bit smaller target. There was a lot of criticism of Labor for being quite small target, but if you think about the coalition campaign as well, there weren't a huge number of big ticket issues that they were really platforming or saying that this is what we'll do within our next term. And so sometimes that opens up to look at issues that have already happened or issues that might happen. And that's where some of the journalists' questioning comes from, rather than the issues that are directly being campaigned on at that point in time. So I think that that's sort of part of what I observed during the election. In terms of your question about journalists working together, I think even during sitting weeks and not during elections, there's a lot of not like in a conspiracy way or anything, but a lot of help that journalists will give each other, and they'll back each other up. If there's a question that is being asked of a leader or of a politician that they don't answer, sometimes you'll find that the person next to you will back you up and say, well, hang on, you didn't answer their question. I will use mine to re-ask you so that you can give me an answer on that. And I think that's quite a great thing in the press gallery.
I would say no gotchas. Like, hopefully we've all learnt that lesson now after Adam Band absolutely smacked that question about the wage price index out of the park at the press club with Google it, which was just, I was there and it was just music to my ears, because I'm like, now I know I'm not going to have to watch another press conference that's just a pop quiz, because this is it. This is the end of the gotcha question in this campaign. In terms of other changes, look, I think that we have to learn the lesson that a good campaigner, meaning someone that produces good images for TV, it does not make you a good Prime Minister, and that we have to have more substance in our coverage. And the moments that Clare mentioned were very good moments, you know, like grilling Scott Morrison about an integrity commission was great. Grilling him about Catherine, his position on Catherine Deeves was great, because it went to the substance. But a lot of the sort of standing around grumbling that Anthony Albanese doesn't perform for the cameras in the same way that Scott Morrison does was like, that was just pathetic. I mean, they're not trained monkeys. They're not there to do tricks. They're there to answer serious questions and to, you know, hopefully be able to explain their policies and why they should be PM. And eventually, I think Morrison ran out of tricks, and it became clear that it didn't matter how many homeowners that got $25,000 of home builder and how many safe, picture opportunities he created. Was he going to be able to spin his way out of it?
I'll get through a few more questions a bit more quickly. We might not go to every panellist for every question, but I did want to dwell on that. It's been a big issue of discussion, the media coverage of the campaign itself. So thank you all for dipping into that. But next question.
Yeah, just touching on the media coverage, is an election campaign actually beneficial to anyone in Australia? Like, I know a lot of people have gone to who live in marginal areas, and having Scott Morrison come and say, oh, we're going to build this, isn't necessarily beneficial, and it seems to be a lot of more showboating and showmanship rather than anything real.
In the campaign?
Just quickly, I think it's important to remember that millions and millions of Australians do not have time or the desire, as is their right, to pay attention for 365 days a year to politics. We know that a third of Australians were undecided in the last week of the election. That is why the campaign exists. It may be artificial and all of those things, and to be honest, that's why the media behaves the way they do. We don't go into it thinking, oh gee, look at Scott Morrison, he's kicking a football. We go, okay, well, this is the opportunity that we have to try and show that 30% of the voting public the kinds of choice that they have, and I think that's really important. So are there better ways for the leaders over the course of 3 years to engage with the local community? Absolutely. Is the reality of Australia that a lot of people don't have an interest or the time for that? Absolutely. What's the only solution we have, and it's an imperfect one, but it's the only solution we have, is a campaign.
It's a good question. So let's have a go at it from the other two. Least worst, or does it serve a useful function? Is it illuminating? And I guess bigger picture, did it matter? Was Labor always going to win? I mean, a lot of people have said it. Albanese performed terribly through the campaign compared to Scott Morrison. Scott Morrison seemed better briefed and better on message. Did the campaign matter?
Well, ultimately, I'd say it probably did. There was a lot of commentary around the fact that it was, rather than Scott Morrison's to win, it was Anthony Albanese's to lose. The polls for a long time, and we've obviously learned our lessons from the 2019 election, but the polls were showing that Labor was certainly ahead. I definitely get your argument in the fact that the campaign focuses on those marginal seats. They're promising millions and millions of dollars to people that they're trying to woo. A lot of what happens as well doesn't happen through us. It happens through social media. A lot of the Labor promises and Liberal promises that were made via Facebook, where it was just the local member making a 1-minute video with their local team or the local council, the local community, saying, here we go, here's $1,000 for this project that you've been wanting for a really long time. What sort of benefit that adds, I can't really say, but there's certainly something to be said for, at least within those 6 weeks or 5 weeks or however long it is, really paying attention to who they really need and who really and who's, as Claire said, and who's undecided within this. So there's certainly, it's not ideal in a way, and there should be more engagement with the community throughout the whole term. But it does bring a spotlight. It does bring a big spotlight to some of the big issues that the nation does face within that sort of period.
Well, you can answer it after the next question if you want as well as part of the next one. We'll get through a couple more. We're going to go a few more minutes past 7:30 because we're a bit late starting. Another question here.
This kind of ties into the last one anyway. Having, like, obviously being media professionals and having just justified the importance of a campaign, what do you think was more persuasive, the media for this election or those grassroots door knockers and people in the local community pulling you over on the side of the road, telling you about a specific party or independent? Or
Yeah, I think it's a good point that nothing is more persuasive than someone actually making the effort to door knock you and to ask what your issue is and how they can help you. I did a swing through WA for our marginal seat coverage in Swan, Curtin, and Hasluck, and yeah, that is what people say if you're out with a politician knocking on their door, is like, oh my God, you turned up, like, you know, full marks to you. Isn't that great? We can have a conversation now. And you see, you know, people who, in this case, I was out with Zanetta Mascarenhas from Labor, that, you know, she was very adept at talking to people that had voted Steve Irons there, you know, for years and years, and probably, or may have voted for her instead of her Liberal opponent. So yes, it's very persuasive. You see that in Brisbane, in the Greens results cutting through. Like, the Greens weren't very prominent in the national media coverage, but you know, seemed persuaded possibly 3 electorates in Brisbane to go for them. So yeah, I think those are very persuasive. But the national frame is also very important. Like, you know, people's lived conditions about, you know, everything's going up but your wages. Labor's message about that would have also persuaded a lot of people who, you know, wouldn't have got a door knock or from a politician. So they both work. They both work, and parties really should be doing both to reach as many people as possible.
Next question. We'll go through a couple more.
I've just heard a lot about Liberal versus Labor. I'd go back to that this is the most progressive thing since 72, and I hope the next one just blows them both away. And you won't be just talking Labor versus Liberal. Integrity Commission might be easy, but there'll be other things. The treatment of women is just not going to go away easily because it's run by, you know, our systems are run by men. And the other thing that's not going to be easily put to bed is climate action, climate change. And there was the thing nobody wanted to talk about, but then was critical for this election. And this is a bit of a left field one, what can climate activists do with easy targets with the coalition? What can they do that's going to make an impact for greater climate action? Because you know, at the moment we've, you know, don't want to go too hard on a government that's, you know, not shit but still shit light. So I don't know, some insights there, because I think there's a lot of climate activists thinking, well, what's the best way to actually maybe get some press as well, but also actually have an impact. Thank you.
Anybody want to have a go?
I'll have a crack. If you speak to any of the many actual Labor MPs that were in government in the Rudd-Gillard years, they are still furious at the Greens for what they see as letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so I think that's where you're coming from, right? You've got the Greens and the Teals who want to higher than the 43% reduction by 2030. I think that it's important, actually, almost nothing to do with Labor and the government, but everything to do with voters in Herbert and Bass and Hasluck and all of those electorates that vote and the Hunter that vote a certain way on climate, because there are dozens of people in Parliament who are answerable to an electorate who is deeply terrified of the direct impact that climate action will have on their lives and livelihoods. And at the end of the day, those people standing in Parliament are going to feel answerable to that electorate. So in terms of how you pave the way, if your goal is a greater, for example, 2030 target or other issue, it would be to work towards showing the people that are answerable to those electorates that they're not going to be punished for taking a certain stand. It's actually remains a grassroots issue, if anything. Top down, I think we've seen in the last 10, 15 years of climate politics in Australia doesn't tend to last very long.
I'm going to take a couple of questions, and you can all answer whichever ones you want. So we'll come forward and ask your question, and then we'll get everybody to pick and choose which bits they want to answer.
Okay, we've seen you've covered grassroots campaigns and grassroots issues, but we haven't really talked very much about grassroots candidates. So what is the future of parachuting these high-profile candidates into electorates where they don't live?
We'll take one more question, and then we can answer them all at once.
So my question is, do you foresee, given the low primary votes from the major parties, do you see the need for more coalition building in the future, similar to what you might see in Europe? I might add another question if that's okay. On that as well, do you foresee the breakdown, that's a bit dramatic, but the breakdown of the Liberal National Coalition, noting potentially the differences in their traditional constituencies?
Well, we've got the big picture and the grassroots picture, parachuting candidates in, a major party vote that's gone from 75% in 2019 to below 70 at this election. Does that mean a breakdown of the system? Does that mean new coalitions? Does that mean a breakup of existing ones?
I think that Labor will spend some effort in outreach to the crossbench for the rainy day of, what happens in the 48th or 49th Parliament, because with such a large crossbench, some of them are going to win again, if not most of them, and we will have a hung Parliament again, if not this time, then next time. So I think there'll be some serious outreach going on there. In terms of the Liberal National Coalition, possibly in opposition, they might go their separate ways to have brand differentiation. But again, the Parliament is now so fractured that those two parties are not going to be in government except with each other, and possibly with a third slice of teal independence in the near future. So that they might go their separate ways, but they will need to bring it together again at some point to form government. So it could get a little willing in this term of Parliament, though.
I'd just say that I think it was this morning, Karen Andrews, the former Home Affairs Minister, was talking about the fact that they would hope that a lot of the sort of teal candidates and some of those independents would actually be able to come to the major parties or to the Liberal Party. So it potentially might inspire the major parties to look within and see who they're attracting and how they can platform them in the best way possible to potentially get that primary vote back up again, because as you said, it was quite a big loss for them this time, extremely low. And so they might look at themselves to see how they can attract some more of those different people. In terms of the parachuting, I think some lessons have been learned, perhaps. Whether it'll happen again, it's hard to say. A lot of that is in the factional politics within the parties themselves. So
I actually disagree that lessons have been learned on the parachuting, only because I think they've definitely tested the limits. But the parachuting is actually just an egregious symptom of what has existed in both major parties since the dawn of time, which is the captain's pick. And Anthony Albanese might have lost his captain's pick in Fowler because it was a bridge too far, but he did not lose his captain's pick in Parramatta. He did not lose his captain's pick in the Hunter. And there are several captain's picks that Scott Morrison also did not lose. So I think it's actually, the example of Fowler is an easy one to grasp because it, you know, as I say, it was egregious. And not in the least when you start to factor in the kind of the way the New South Wales electorate generally feels about Christina Keneally. But I don't think that they will push it that far again. But the reason, and I think this is important, the reason they felt confident that it would work is because it has worked literally every other time and continued to work in this election. And I think that will mean that they will continue, you know, maybe they will profile someone a bit better this time to suit the electorate, but I don't think you can discount what is at the root of that parachuting, which was a captain's call from a leader who felt that they knew better. And just broadly, I would say on the future of coalitions and what the parliament makeup looks like, I think we've had a real moment in this period, not just because of the result, but look at the last 3 years. Like, no one, if you said 3 years ago what the next 3 was going to look like, would have believed you. And there has been an immense fracturing. I know it's unsettled, but if I'm going to say, for example, if Gilmore gets picked up by the Libs, if you take Gilmore in New South Wales, Herbert up in Townsville in Queensland, and Bass down in Launceston, the only places swings toward the Libs. 3 candidates: Phil Thompson, who had a big fight with Scott Morrison over a Royal Commission into veteran suicide; Bridget Archer, who had several fights with Scott Morrison over her various issues; and then you've got Andrew Constance in Gilmore, who went on national television and had a big fight with Scott Morrison during the fires. This was a vote that, even when it didn't go toward teals and other things, was a vote against Scott Morrison across the board, major party or otherwise. But I think that the electorate now just wants politics to go away. And if politics is in their face for the next 3 years because of a fractured parliament, because of the negotiations and the crossbench every single time, do not discount a rejection of that and a massive swing one way or the other toward major party. We saw it happen in 2013 with Tony Abbott after what was still largely quite a successful minority government. So I wouldn't say that we're too early to say that this is a trend, would be my thing.
Can you please thank Clare, Krishani and Paul? It's fascinating insights. We're lucky to have had you. They've done it for free. We've got them a bottle of wine, but there was no need for them to come out here tonight and share the stories. They've had a busy time. We really appreciate it. I think our democracy is served well when journalists as well as politicians are willing to front up and talk about issues and sometimes hard ones. Thank you all of you for coming. If you want to come to future events, please subscribe on the website. Donate if you can. We can't put these things on for nothing. Your support is really very well received. It's the end of financial year. Donations to the Australia Institute are fully tax deductible. Thanks all for coming and being engaged. Democracy is about those who show up. Finally, thanks to the Australia Institute team who helps put on events like this, and for all the research and advocacy and engagement in public life. Hannah and Eleanor and Hayden who helped put on tonight. We can't do it. None of you would be able to enjoy anything like this without that great team of people. So thank you to all of you. Thank you for coming.